I want you to name a developed country that doesn't have nuclear power, and I'll give you the answer. It's Australia. My new friend, Mark Schneider, is American, and he was in the nuclear Navy, so he had a similar path, of course, many years later. But he is trying to restart nuclear power in Australia. They already have nuclear energy. They have some research reactors. But he's taking what he learned in the submarine service and what he knows through the commercial nuclear world, through NRC and different things, and he's trying to blend it. It's a long, tough slog, but if anybody can pull it off, he can do it. I call him the Elon Musk of nuclear power. He's just so sharp. So I think you're going to really enjoy this episode with Mark Schneider. Yeah, and to be honest with you, I'm super curious about Australia and their journey in nuclear power, but I want to get to know you a little bit more, if you don't mind. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Northwest Oregon, a little town outside of Portland called Forest Grove. It's known for having the world's tallest barber pole. It's stupid, useless fact you know about your hometown. So they would do a big festival called the Gay 90s, and that's gay and happy, not the more colloquial term.
Do they still have it?
No, it ended in the 1990s.
I was going to say, 90s, that probably didn't.
This is where the barber pole thing comes in, is that they did a big barbershop quartet competition. The Gay 90 parade was all based on that 1890s cultural phenomenon.
So what kind of childhood did you have?
So yeah, childhood, that's an interesting one. I'm the third generation graduate of my high school. My grandmother was the valedictorian of the class of 4, I believe. My mom's father was a minister. My dad's father was a mortician. And so they were, for all intents and purposes, business partners in a manner. If a family had lost someone and my mother's father was there consoling them and saying, you have arrangements, let me reach out to Bob Schneider and he can help you. And then my father's father had a deceased person and their family was there. Do you have a minister? If not, I have one available. I joke that my family's humor kills. It's all dark. You haven't lived until you've done an Easter egg hunt or played hide and seek in the rental coffins. That I grew up with when I was about 4 years old. My parents separated and eventually divorced. So I was preschool age. Mm-hmm. And my grandparents came together and said, how are we going to watch Mark? Well, my parents are both working. And so I tagged along with my grandparents. I was going to the cemeteries and helping with the gravesite stuff. I was going to nursing homes and hanging out with my grandpa as he was hanging out with all, seeing his flock, if you will. When my mom's dad died in 1995, at his funeral, they had his Bible, and he had written down every wedding and funeral he had done in his Bible. It was like 800 weddings and 1,600 funerals. One of the things that was really funny that he would say is when asked if he preferred doing weddings or funerals, he would say funerals because he hadn't one fail yet.
So
that's that dark humor that I grew up with, which works well if you go into the military, obviously, you being
absolutely. So how did you end up going into the military?
I was in high school taking AP Physics, and my physics teacher, Mike Fitzgibbons, we did a segment on the charter-nucleides, a little bit into how nuclear worked, primarily just if I absorb a neutron, chart it through the charter-nucleides, right? And that was like crack. It was so addicting to me to see the chart. I actually have the full charter-nucleides. I have to get it reframed now that I'm in Australia. But it was in my office in the U.S., so I'm full-blown nerd with all that. So I decided at 16 I wanted to be nuclear. That was my goal. I wanted to work in nuclear because of the charter nucleides, right? Why not?
Yeah.
So I was going around looking at universities. I was looking at Berkeley, and I think there was a place up in New York that I was looking at. Anywhere that had a test reactor, that's where I wanted to go. But I was the 5th of 6 children. There was no money for college for me. So I was like, how do I pay for this? By the way, this is the ultimate naivete. I had no idea that the U.S. Navy had nuclear-powered vessels. I played nerdy games because I'm a nerd. And so I played Warhammer 40K. And there was this Navy guy that I knew that happened to be a Navy recruiter that played Warhammer 40K as well. During my junior year of high school, he had come and I'd fill out a sheet of paper. I'm going to help you out, buddy.
Are you interested in any opportunities?
Yeah, so he calls me in August between my junior and senior year. And he goes, hey, this is Petty Officer Fosjord. And I'm like, Steve, it's Mark. You know me. Let's stop talking. You don't know me. And he goes, oh, hey, Mark. He goes, have you ever thought about joining the Navy? And literally the words out of my mouth, only if the Navy has nuclear power, boy, do I have a job for you.
Yeah. That was right over the plate.
I ended up going through it, took the pre-ASVAB. I scored really well in the pre-ASVAB, and the recruiter was bored, so he came out that day to say, hey, could you hang out? And I took the NFQT before I took the actual ASVAB, so I'm like one of the few people that did it backwards. And then I ended up in boot camp in June of 1998, 20 days after graduating high school. And then career 20 years.
You were 20 years in the Navy?
Yep, 20 years, 4 months, 2 days. But who's keeping track?
And I saw somewhere on LinkedIn you're still in the Coast Guard?
So I did 20 years in the Navy, and then when I retired, I worked at the power station for Dominion Energy for 3 years.
Right.
And then I got tired of shift work. The pandemic added a lot to it, and the pandemic did not work well because changing rules on masking requirements with coaching requirements. I saw in your bio that you have some experience with IMPO. So you can imagine how often you got coached in that realm as an operator. We were understaffed going into the pandemic. They stopped hiring because of the pandemic. Half the people stopped taking overtime calls. I remember looking at my wife going, tell me it's okay to say no to a double time day. I know it's $1,200, but I just can't. That's my legal limit for working every week. I spent more time at work during the pandemic when everyone was socially distancing. I had less time at home than I ever had outside of being deployed. When I chose to leave Dominion Energy, I got hired by the Coast Guard as a federal employee. I worked as an electrical engineer. I started in command and control. I was the lead engineer for Sea Commander, the ability to integrate all your radars and a whole bunch of your analysis system to basically tell you how to point and shoot the gun. It drives your fire control system from radar and integrates your computer systems, networks. It's an overly complex system. I was in sustainment side, so I was not really super challenged. Then I moved over into communications. I worked in they set up a brand new branch for integrated communication systems because of how complex the comm systems were getting on the Coast Guard. The long range and the short range, and the piecemeal different aspects to it. I said, hey, if they connect between the radios, we need to have a group that manages all that. Because some radios connect and you might have 5 or 18 different radios connecting to one of these systems. Specifically, Symphony is the big piece of communications equipment that connects to it. I did that. It was super cool, the stuff I was doing. I went out to Alameda and I was riding small boats to test boat crew communication systems. Really neat, exciting stuff. Ended up getting a Coast Guard level award, the group of us that were working on that. New processes, blazing new trails. And then I took a promotion. I became the long range systems branch chief. I owned all long range communications on non-aviation assets for the Coast Guard before taking the leap of faith and coming out here to Australia.
Yeah, I want to pull you back. It's such an interesting story because what I'm starting to sense is you probably get bored fairly easily. But that one thing that you talked about, the periodic table, but take me back to your cluelessness about the Navy to this is what I'm learning. This is what it's like operating a nuclear plant. What was that like for you?
So yeah, suddenly learning that there were these nuclear powered warships was super neat to me. I initially was not a submarine volunteer. I only volunteered for submarines when I found out they were decommissioning the cruisers. I wanted to serve on cruisers was my plan. Unfortunately, the last one was in for decommissioning when I joined. I volunteered because I said, aircraft carrier's too big. Submarines, in my opinion, were too small. I wanted a little bit bigger. I wanted something. The high school I grew up in was mid to large size. We had about 1,600 kids. I felt like that was too big. That's why an aircraft appealed to me. I wanted to feel like I could meet everyone. But a submarine just felt way too small, and it felt more like the church my grandpa was a minister at, which had about 120 people. I want everyone to know every detail about me, but I also want to feel like just another body. That's why cruises really appealed to me. Unfortunately, they didn't exist. So I ended up going in and going through boot camp. I was one of those guys that actually laid really low on the radar. One of my drill instructors in boot camp actually had to read my name tag at week 7 because he had no idea who I was. It just was under the radar. It wasn't like I'm a pretty spout off kind of guy. I'm an interject myself, but in boot camp, I was able to my ability to talk. Because you remember that from boot camp, right? All those kids that they just can't figure out how to shut their mouths. And I'm normally one of those people. But I also recognize there are times when to shut your mouth. And so I just kept my mouth shut in boot camp. And it's, wow, this is actually really easy.
The never again volunteer yourself, too. I was always like watching other people like, I'm not going to do that. And you were low in the birth order, so was I. Yeah. So I learned as a kid that it's better to work the angles, and parents don't know what we're up to. They're tired of following us around. So we had a lot of fun.
Yeah, so that was really, so I think boot camp just not flying under the radar. Now, I didn't fly under the radar when I got to A school in Charleston. I got myself into some trouble because I was a little lippy. And I would say, I didn't go to mass or anything, but I got like an assigned seat or something like that. I think there's another guy that we just did not get along. He was one of those guys that had a mouth that didn't know how to control it. And we would just bicker. He ended up getting kicked out in A school. So he couldn't hack it. And so A school, I did fairly well. I wasn't like top of my class. I was, I think, 3.6. So I did very well.
And you're an electrician?
The electronics technician.
Electronics technician.
Yeah. Probably the big thing for my school time is that meeting Kevin Witt, that's where our journeys began together. He was my mentor all through my career. And so we'll continue back through him as we go through here. So, a good student. Didn't get in a whole lot of trouble. Just got done with school, then went to power school. I know that I tried to do as few study hours as I could because I didn't have to be in the building. I remember going into, you probably went through Orlando, right?
Yeah.
So Charleston was brand new. So I do remember arriving in Charleston and they still hadn't laid the grass down yet. Yeah. One of my claim to fame is that I was actually one of the first people that polished the atom in the middle of Rickover Circle because it was brand new. When I showed up, there were 300 students in Charleston. So there weren't a lot of us because Orlando was still at the process of just winding. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So Power School went over there. I remember walking into the building. This is obviously 6 months later. We're now thousands of students. And I remember all these kids coming out going, don't do it. Turn away. It sucks. You're going to be here all the time. I'm like, whatever. Went through Power School. It's one of those things where the Navy planned and designed the building without thinking about the number of students they were going to have. So the new building, the first and second floors were enlisted and the third floor was officers. There are 40 classrooms for the enlisted, and there were 41 classes when I went through when they stood up 905. We were the top performing class. My Power School class, we had the top grades. We had the highest grades on heat transfer fluid flow as a class on that current revision of it. So class average of 3.6. Wow. But we had guys that were, no one was 4.0ing tests, but we're talking 50 of us, 20 people are getting 3.9s. We were knocking it out of the water. We were just a group of people that melded real well together. So they moved us up in with the officers. So we were up on the third floor with the officers, which is really interesting because you don't realize how intimidated ensigns are by enlisted until you're working side by side with them.
More.
Yeah, it was just interesting. Like they would literally were afraid by having us there. They were so segregated and isolated in Charleston, but which I thought was interesting. The JGs were super chill. The surface guys were they come up and talk to us, but the ensigns were the sub guys were terrified of us.
Yeah, it makes sense though too. Is you're supposed to be over and above people, and you're probably learning that part of the job.
And then it was interesting is that our class also, 9904, my Power School class, had 3 PXOs, so we had 3 commanders as part of the class. So we're chatting with them, and here we are, E4s. Yeah. So Power School, I enjoyed Power School, I had a great time. I had a best friend, Eric, and we shared a bathroom. We were neighbors.
Jack and Jill or whatever. Yeah,
Jack and Jill style. And so we did everything together. I was 19 at that point. He was 24. He was an older guy for especially the nuke program. I remember going to New Jersey to rescue his brother who was living out of his car, just going on road trips with him, going down to Georgia, going down to Florida. Yeah. I had the car. So I had a 97 Dodge Stratus that we would drive, which is not a great car, but it was roomy. And you could fit 4 people in there and we'd go road tripping. And I was underage, so I was typically the DD. So yeah, Power School was a lot of fun. And then Prototype, I was actually slated to go to New York, but my school roommate, who was my yeoman in boot camp from our division, he was from New York and wanted to go to New York. When I put my wish list between New York and Charleston, I put New York down because my brother was stationed up there. He was in the Army at the time, my stepbrother, my oldest brother. And I was like, yeah, I'll go to New York because I got family up there. Sure. And then Richard comes up to me and says, hey, he goes, you going to Charleston? I said, yeah. He goes, is there any way that we could swap? Because I'd love to be near family. And I'm like, yeah, sure. So we end up swapping prototypes. So I went to Charleston for Prototype, and you talk about the being bored thing, and that's like a theme if I'm not engaged. Prototype was like the ideal environment for me because that self-paced nature, like I qualified before a dozen students in the class ahead of me. Like I had 2 months as a qualified student.
That's crazy.
Yeah, so I was standing watch. I qualified in 4 months. It was just like, it was awesome. And I loved it. Like the whole qual program, I just excelled at it. Like it's just the rapid fire, grab information, go in and talk to someone. I was the guy that would be in a queue. I'd always have 4 checkouts. I'd always be checking a mechanical, an ELT, an electrical, and an ET system at all times. Literally every morning I'd go to the cube list and sign up.
Let me ask you this question. For me, learning the theory, I could do that. But it wasn't until one day it just started clicking, like how everything worked. Like I knew what to expect, the xenon transient. I'm going to see frequency change on the turbine generator. What was that process like for you? Did it click in the beginning?
I think it really did. The information was so exciting to me. So when you're really, really passionate about what you're doing, you just love it. I'm constantly immersing myself in nuclear energy. That's just who I am. Obviously, you've probably seen all my millions of LinkedIn posts about the Grace Stanky tour and all the stuff going on in Australia. Yep. She just departed today back to the States. So at the same time, my wife has a group of people that are out here, and my good buddy Jose and I, we were on the Abraham Lincoln together. He's part of the team that came out to support the work that my wife is doing. And Jose came over to our house, and there were other people from the team, and we start talking, and we're talking. He's a weld engineer. And for my time in naval reactors, I'm talking about the stuff that I did. And Jose looks over at my wife. He goes, I've never seen someone who loves nuclear power as much as Mark. Like he just, you can see he's just passionate. Like he's excited about it. So the whole clicking thing, there was never a moment when it really just clicked. It was just, I wanted to know it. So there was no, the aha moment. Like I had aha moments later on in my career, specifically on the carrier when the information there suddenly clicked. Because it's more complex, more difficult than a submarine reactor. But it was just, I don't know, it was a numbers game, right? And I'm very self-competitive and even competitive with other people. But you could get checkouts, and checkouts means you get less study or less time at work. You also get the attaboys for being ahead. And I remember at Prototype, you had your daily count or whatever, it was like 42 for ETs at the beginning. And then like after a certain point, it dropped down to 21. And I remember like my goal was to double it every day. Was how I pushed through. So when I say that I qualified 2 months early, I also, my qual card was complete with the exception of my board and two observes that I had to get done because I had to collapse the bubble and draw a bubble. I waited a month for that. I actually would have been done in about 3 months.
That's crazy. It reminds me, I hired a career coach because I had a job I really didn't like. And he said, you want to do the thing that gets other people excited when you talk about it, and nuclear power is that for you.
Yeah.
For sure.
Oh, it really is. Yeah. I love talking about nuclear power. It's just so cool. Like when you think about it, one of the things that I learned recently, right? I'm going through and I'm writing training that's designed to be more than what you would find on like the DOE website, the public forums, right? I'm building training for companies that are going to get work in the nuclear supply chain in Australia. How do I take a group of people off the street, get them enough information on nuclear energy that they don't have to look for? It's available to them. They're going to pay me for it. But it's got to be more detailed than what you find on YouTube. It's got to be relevant. Right. So I'm building as a premise. This is a one-day course on terms, end in accidents, and policies that prevent recurrence, right? But being able to show that excitement. As I'm building this out, I'm looking at I haven't done mass balance calculation I haven't done that since maybe Power School. I don't remember doing those in the fleet or at Prototype. I think it was Power School when we did them. find a couple of example problems, show me the mass balance, and then I did the calculation myself. And then it was 210 megaelectron volts. What does 210 megaelectron volts mean? What does that mean? If I am a person on the world, what does that mean? I don't know how correct ChatGPT is, but it says it's the equivalent of lifting a paperclip about a millimeter.
Yeah.
And I suddenly go, holy shit. You don't think about how much energy is in that when you do it. Like when you're doing the calculations, they're numbers, they don't mean anything. And it never been quantified to me in that manner. I'm like going, whoa, that's a lot of energy from one atom. You just don't realize how much power we're generating and all that. But I just didn't realize how few atoms were splitting to make this happen. Like it wasn't really processing in my mind how much energy we're generating, like down to the quantum level.
And you think about it with such promise when they've discovered this in the 40s and they're like, we're going to apply this. We don't have to worry about energy ever again because we have so much of it and so compact. We know how to control it.
Yeah.
With such promise.
Yeah, it's so crazy. Like, we just don't think about the energy and the power. And then obviously I'm trying to make this so that I can present it. And I'm talking about residual heat, right? You're obviously aware that we have to manage that heat.
That's a big one.
You know, what's a good example? So I saw on our slide talking about residual heat. When you shut down the reactor, you got to manage it. So Surrey Power Station, they're about 2,500 megawatt thermal. Their residual heat is more than the energy needed to push the largest cruise ship through the water, to maintain and operate the largest cruise ship. Like, I'm like, oh, that's a lot of energy. Again, you think in numbers into the 7-8%, right, of your 100% of the power level you're operating at. And then you suddenly go, oh, wow, that's a lot of energy, right?
As an aside, you made me think about Grace, but who would ever thought a Miss America would have a nuclear background, for one, but two, what you just described. And I think one of the things, I've been in the industry since 1980, what I've recognized is we did not communicate any of this to people, the benefits and the technology in a way that they could understand. And I remember when 3 Mile Island happened and what a fiasco it was, just trying to get information. What's this hydrogen thing? All of it implanted in people this fear. But like you said, you got to manage it. And it's just like anything else in life. You can't just say, I hope that plane engine works every time we start it. But for whatever reason, we started behind almost, and now we're still trying to catch up.
I'm very much quoted as saying that the nuclear industry picks the worst words. Let's think about, if I tell you the reactor is critical, you're going, oh, neat, the reactor's operating, right? K effective equals 1, congratulations. That's a pretty cool thing. But you tell the public the reactor is critical, they go, oh my gosh, because when a patient is critical, they're dying. Yeah. What if I told you the reactor is super critical? It just means power's going up.
Yeah.
So understanding that not only did we fail to address things like 3 Mile Island very well, or fail to provide the information in an easy, managed, digestible method, but we also then pick words that make it even harder.
Yeah, I'm super curious about, and we're going all over the place, but now that there's no longer gatekeepers with information, we got to go through a certain way, and you can get long form, like Joe Rogan's podcast can be 2 hours long. It's not a big deal, but you can dive deeply into things. How do you think that environment is going to change what happens in Australia?
So I was deeply involved in the change in the U.S. in 2019. I watched as nuclear having 45% approval support. Yeah. And it was like 55% against, using rough numbers. And I watched it change. And I know that the things that I was saying were being put out. I was going on Scott Adams, the creator of Dilbert. He released his 3-comic series in February of 2019 based off of our communications. It was really interesting seeing all of that, seeing the transformation, the anti-nuclear mindset to a much more pro-nuclear. I developed somewhat of a friendly rivalry with a guy named Mike Schellenberger. I'm sure you've heard of him. When I was advocating, I was actually in the process prior to the pandemic of becoming a full-time advocate, engaging in a speaking tour, starting in the United Kingdom. I was going to get paid to talk about nuclear energy. Then the pandemic hit and that destroyed everything. I had developed a relatively huge following on social media. And so Schellenberger was big at that time. And my big thing was that my tag on Twitter at the time was I was the nuclear futurist. And what about Schellenberg? So he's the nuclear presentist. So he's about what we have now, and I'm about what we can in the future. And part of the change of the narrative was because we were two pretty big voices that were being amplified by some other voices. We may not have been directly in the conversations with each other or with the people that were talking about it, but you could see the discussion of, do I build big reactors like AP1000s, or do I build small modular and Gen 4 reactors, but change the conversation from a yes, no to a this or that.
Yes.
So because yes, no, the answer is the human mind is really good at picking between two options. We're not good with a third. I always joke that the U.S. military or the U.S. government always picks three. And they start with three and then immediately knock one out, right? And then it all comes down to the F-22 versus the F-23. Really, the freedom versus the independence littoral class, and the U.S. Navy said, no, we'll just do both, and they'll both suck.
I think, too, part of the forcing function was the Paris Climate Accords, and everybody started looking around and saying, wait a minute, France is doing pretty well. They got a lot of nuclear plants, and then what about everybody else?
It's really funny you mentioned that. So when I went to an event in St. Louis where I was speak about nuclear energy. Remember, this is not an anti-nuclear crowd, but this was a relatively pro-fossil fuel crowd. And I had mentioned that France, 70% nuclear, has its electricity cost is half that of Germany, which is phasing out nuclear. And this guy's arguing with me that's not true. And I'm like, I don't know how to help you when you're arguing against reality. Like, the reality says this. Like, this isn't me making it up. This is me telling you what is occurring right now. France pays half the price for electricity than Germany. You can disagree with the reality all you want, but that's what's happening. And I remember the other thing is there was this woman who came up to the mic to ask me a series of questions. And she was from Pennsylvania, lived through the 3 Mile Island incident, not in Harrisburg. So she was like adjacent to. And I was breaking down all of her fears. And then she goes, I just don't understand why you say it's so safe. I just don't get it. And I remember looking at her like, ma'am, I cannot fix your fears. I can only tell you the facts behind the circumstances. That's a you problem that you need to address. I cannot fix your fears for you. And it was really interesting because I saw the looks on the crowd. And as I said it, they're like, oh, wow. Like, I've never heard an advocate go through, break everything down. And then when they say, I'm still afraid, I can't fix you. It's not my job to fix you. That's a you issue.
That's a great point. I was at a conference years ago, and I talked to a guy that was doing a similar thing. So they have a pro-nuclear person and somebody was against it. And he said inevitably they walked off the stage and you don't care about people, whatever, some emotional argument. And he would have dinner with these folks. And he said, why do you do that? And he said, listen, if we didn't, nobody would give money to my organization. So and it's true. You have to put emotion behind things. And my point, of course, as a logical nuclear person is, like you said, what I don't like is fueling those fears, and it keeps us where we are. I remember when I was in Maryland at Calvert Cliffs, one of our friends, it was a neighbor, she had a Geiger counter on her porch because she did not trust the fact that we were going to release radioactivity into the atmosphere, and she was the one that was going to catch it or whatever. But I don't know, like your approach, how do you even talk to someone like that? It's so far removed from what we're used to and understand.
Yeah, and it was interesting when I was down in Collie last week. Collie's a small little coal mining / power town here in Western Australia. And there was an anti-nuclear advocate there. And I walked up and he came in aggressive, guns blazing. We're actually told as the panelists not to engage him. It's a small enough event. I can do that. He opens up, and I'd never heard this until I got to Australia. He opens up with, no amount of radiation received is safe.
Oh, boy.
And I go, radiation is natural. And I'm like, so I'm literally breaking down all his arguments. And he goes, plutonium's not natural. I said, I'm going to disagree with you on that. I said, have you ever heard of the Oklo reactor in Gabon? It produced plutonium in the process of generating nuclear energy, and it predates humanity. And so I just would break down every single one of his arguments, and then he'd go, what about 3 Mile Island and Fukushima? And as I was answering, he'd just start interjecting with spites, right? And you could tell that he'd been trained, whether he'd learned. This is not his first rodeo with all this. And finally, as he's going through, we get to the end. I could feel my emotions starting to rise. So it's time for me to end this. And I said, finally, as he's going through the actions, so what amount of deaths do you consider acceptable for your power generation? And he looks at me, he goes, 0. And I go, then I'm going to leave you with this. Wind kills 14 people a year in the United Kingdom. And just walked away. And I saw him walk into the event, and I've never seen someone more broken in my life. Like, he was dejected. And you could tell he was very passionate. And then Grace gets up and speaks, and she goes, hey, I pulled up the OSHA reports on the safest occupational workplaces in the United States. And you go, what do you think is the safest? Or where do you think nuclear falls in that? Do you think it's the top of the list? Do you think it's bottom list? And fairly pro-nuclear crowd. So yeah, it's top of the list. She goes, I wish it was, but it's not. It's number 6. What is safer than nuclear? Data analytics.
That's great.
So nuclear energy in the United States is so safe, heavy industry, right? It is a heavy industrial process. It is so safe that you have to sit behind a desk to get something that is safer than that. Like, grocery store workers are more likely to have a workplace injury or workplace death than working at a nuclear power station. Things that I've learned, right? And again,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's crazy. So it's, and again, right, as Grace is saying this, I'm looking over at this older gentleman, and he looks like just a whipped dog at this point.
You talked about emotion. It's funny. As I'm 63 years old, I look at people, their whole world is, as you get older, especially, it's based on certain tenets. And if you start breaking that apart, like you said, the guy's lost, you got to fill that up with something. And if you're not ready for it, it's very scary for people to say, wait a minute, this stuff I've been believing for the last 50 years is maybe not be true or as accurate as I thought. Then they have to change their whole worldview.
So one thing that's interesting is that the best question I've ever been asked in my advocacy, even going back to being a young nuclear operator in the U.S. Navy, the best questions ever been asked me was, I did a radio interview, not related to the Nuclear for Australia work, but for my professional work that I'm doing with supporting ISO 19443, the nuclear supply chain certifications. We did a big media blitz with my company. And so I was interviewed on the radio. And the radio DJ, or radio host, asked me, he goes, so what scares you about nuclear energy? And I was so taken aback at how smart that question was.
Yeah.
Like, it was like, that is a really good question. And so I said, what does scare me? It's steam, it's fires, it's electrical, but it's not the radiation. We know where the radiation is. We've monitored it. Like, I can go on the map and I can see it. Like, there's doors that are locked behind it, so it can't go behind the locked doors. If it's a locked high radiation, if it's super dangerous, it says grave. You don't go where the grave is. We're so good at knowing where that stuff is that we don't think about it. And I just did a podcast this week called the Gold Room Podcast, so a mining group. And they had interviewed the guy that was our MC down in Cali, and he was rehashing some of the stuff. Josh, the guy who is the host of the Gold Room Podcast, was asking Jonathan, it was when Mark spoke, and he mentioned about the clothing you have to wear. And he goes, you wear paper to protect yourself from the radiation, using radiation and radioactivity.
That's great.
Obviously. And so I did the podcast, and he literally brought in firefighting gear, and then we obviously don't have protective clothing, so he goes, is there any way you can get that? I said, you got paint suits? I said, it's effectively the same thing. It's just like the Tyvek suits you wear. He goes, yes, I got those. I just in my warehouse. Because he sells mining equipment. So we went and he grabbed a couple of paint suits, and he asked me a question, then he does the quick change, right? So when it gets edited, he'll be in the chair, I'll answer, and then he'll, you mean like this? He's literally wearing full firefighting gear, right? And then we do another thing where we both change in, and we're both sitting there in these Tyvek paint suits, chatting about, this is not exactly what we wear, but it's pretty similar. And I said, I'd be wearing gloves, and there'd be a hard hat with this and a separate hood instead. The whole purpose of this is to protect the public. I don't wear that for my protection. It's for the public, because it's not stopping the radiation that's coming onto me. It's there to control the radioactive material. But basically what I've come down to is that if I have to wear the steam suit, something that's thick and padded, I have to wear the arc flash gear for racking out breakers, I have to wear firefighting equipment to fight fires, if I have to wear big, thick gear that's going to actually protect me from energy, then I'm worried. But if I'm wearing paper, I'm not afraid of something that can be stopped by paper.
That's great.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that's been a big thing, is being able to explain that.
Yeah. I want to fast forward to, so you're in Australia. Right now, there's laws that prevent the development of nuclear power plants. But I guess they see the handwriting on the wall. There's many countries that have said, no, we're going to change that. But the other part of me tells me that you like doing things. You don't just like talking and having meetings. How do you see that working out in Australia in a way that will allow you to keep working and actually doing things versus let's have another meeting to talk about the standards we have to create?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So right now I'm actually helping the regulator write their policies, which is very different. It's not in my junior career. If I'd have been told that, I'd be trying to make the word sound gooder. Like that would be as I'm in front of my inability to speak. So I'd be the one who's doing the formatting and all that. No, there's a whole group of people who do that. I literally am reviewing it going, hey, you talk about a graded approach, and then you're talking about your technical officers, you need to evaluate them using a graded approach. Is that the same graded approach? Or because there's a specific definition by the IEA standard that is for a graded approach when it comes to evaluating nuclear, or are you putting on your good HR hat and saying, they go, oh yeah, that's a good one. Or things like there was another issue where they were in the regulations talk. It's designed around their version of the resident engineer field rep for naval reactors. So the Australian version of that, being able to go into a facility and review logs and records, right?
Unfettered access.
Yeah, and they're working on the unfettered access type thing. But they have this thing about being able to operate equipment to gain access to logs and records. They mean computers. Right, but they're using a language that is open-ended so that what is the next thing that is not computers? Me being the operator going, what's a computer? I don't know if you've seen the modern submarine reactors. It's literally 6 LCD screens.
I didn't know that.
Which literally to change screens, you push buttons. And they're required to have, when they're critical, there's 4 screens they're mandated to have. When you're shut down, there's 3 mandated screens for the propulsion plant operator. So knowing this, I'm like going, all right, let me put myself in the minds of an NRO rep that thinks they have access to a boat that ends up with their freaking M16 to their temple and a freaking boot on their neck because there are policies they have to follow, and some of them think that they're above the policies. So let me write this so that they are not pushing buttons on a panel and end up getting the crap kicked out of them by sailors that are like, what are you doing touching my panel? I can operate equipment to obtain information, and I need to see the information that's on this page. Right? So I go, all right, so let me add in words, say, must qualified, licensed, or certified to operate the equipment. And then but I also proceeded to say, hey, you've got to treat the people that are going to be doing these that are going to be working for you, conducting the audits, conducting the surveillances, they call them inspections in Australia. You've got to treat them like they're children. And I told my kids one time that they could not use tape, glue, stickers to attach things to the wall. But you know what I didn't tell them? They could not use peanut butter to do that. So I came in and they had peanut buttered their things to the wall. I'm putting myself in that mind going, we have to be to that level of specificity, but I also want to be general enough. And saying you have licensed, certified, qualified to operate something. Yeah.
It gets me thinking about the U.S. industry, and DOGE is in the headlines, but I look at what NRC has done over the years, and right, wrong, or indifferent, they found ways to slow down things that maybe not should have been slowed down. And being clear, like you described, makes so much sense to me, especially with the new reactors and how the regulations currently read. So it sounds like you're trying to be more specific, helps prevent that. Anything else from an Australian standpoint that you're doing to help them along so they can actually build stuff and do it?
Here's one that did not require me, but my wife and I, before I came over here, had talked about it. I said, if you put Mark Schneider in charge of the regulations of writing them for naval nuclear power for Australia, how would Mark write it? So that if you repeal your construct, you could copy this, paste, remove the word submarine, and insert it. That's how they're being written. Without me even, I'm reading it like this is written as if someone's ready for commercial nuclear power. Like they're referencing NRC. It is so smart. It's taking, and then understanding the Australia cannot regulate the way the U.S. regulates with the Australia cannot regulate the United Kingdom regulates. Their laws don't allow it. but it's a blend of the two. And I like using, this is my new favorite analogy when describing that. So the U.S. regulatory policy is stop signs, right? You come up to a T intersection, there's a stop sign there. You fail to stop, there's some regulator that's probably in a uniform with lights that's going to give you a giant ticket for being bad, right? That's the U.S. very draconian, thou shalt stop, I don't care. You don't get to determine whether or not you stop, right? That's that very, it slows things down, right? Talking about the unnecessary slowing down. The UK model is we use a give way sign. It's on you, the operator of the vehicle, to make sure you don't run into that vehicle. So what you determine to be slow, and then we might turn and say, hey, yeah, probably should have slowed a little more there. Yes, it's 2 a.m., running right through that. That's not the intent of the give way sign. So it's very much more of a negotiation in their regulatory model. Australia is a blend of the two. So there's certain things that have to be stop signs, certain things that they allow the industry to set up the regulatory framework.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so cool, though. It's almost like you have a green field. Take your background and experience and apply it.
And that's been the fun thing about this, is that I don't have to take the lessons that were learned in blood in the United States and build off of a program and keep adding to it. The house we live in was built in the 1930s, the one that we live in Australia, and they call them extensions in the U.S. There's been like 4 additions on it. And I'm like, do you know how hard it is to do an addition? Yeah. You can probably see me starting to sweat. There's no air conditioning in the room in my office. I normally have a fan running and the door open.
Yeah.
You know, it's just...
You've been on podcasts before.
Yeah. So making sure, that like when you do that, it's like now you're having to adjust the plans. You got to go, there's change you got to make. That's the U.S. regulatory framework, right? The Atomic Energy Act 1954 was written, and then we add on to this, we add on to that. Australia gets the benefit, and then the UK has something similar. They get to go, here's the U.S. system, here's the UK system. We like this, we hate this. And so we get to merge it into this one document and go, here's our policy. Is it going to be perfect? No, it's going to be terrible the first time you release it, and you're going to learn, you have to adjust. But I say terrible, it's going to be a good product. It would provide a safe nuclear operations, but there are some things in it that have to be managed, right? That have to be adjusted. But the fact is you're not going in with the, oh crap, we just melted down our experimental reactors. Right. And going through all that. Yeah. By the way, when I'm going back to the whole Grace Stanky tour, when I was in Melbourne and then when I was in Morwell, so Melbourne, southeast, very southern city on mainland Australia, and then Morwell's due east of that. Coal mining, coal power town. They've got like 3.5, 4 gigawatts worth of coal-fired plants out there. So I'm up there and I'm giving my speeches, talking about different things. Said, safety is important to the nuclear industry. We learn from our mistakes. And I go, I will talk about every accident, about why it happened and what the industry has done to improve upon that so that we do not repeat those mistakes. And I'm so confident in my industry and what nuclear has done with accidents. I am going to tell you about an accident that you have never heard of, and you can ask me how the U.S. Navy protected me from that accident to make sure that we don't repeat that. The accident was SL-1. It's the actual worst nuclear accident in the United States that killed 3 people.
Terrible. It is terrible.
And do you know what it's like to say that in front of a crowd? Like, they're like going, oh my God. It has always frustrated me when we hide the accidents. When I was one of the speaking engagements, it was a political event, and there was a state representative from Idaho that she had the opportunity to go out to the Idaho National Laboratory. And she's out there and she goes, what accident's about here? And they go, I'm like, wrong answer.
Yeah. No.
Wrong answer. You now look like you're hiding. You say, we had the EBR-1 meltdown, and just list them all off and go, here's our accidents. 1960, 1950, list them off and say, here's what we learned from this, right? EBR-1, we pulled the fuel out, we operated it. Go, by the way, we learned from the accident at Sandia that's probably a bad idea to burn our waste, right? That we should probably manage it in a different manner, and go, what we learned from the first U.S. nuclear accident at Sandia in California, right, to what we said just in that short amount of time, and then go SO1. We have rod ejection casualties, the requirements that we manage now. We don't use manual control rods. We psychologically evaluate our people because someone's having an issue with the spouse. We don't want them sabotaging things and trying to murder the other person and ending a murder-suicide, right? Those are the types of things where you go, the industry improves upon itself, and you can explain all that. But when you go, well, now... And that's part of the reason why, and I'm going back to the training I'm building out, it's 10 sessions It's designed around one day. I don't believe in training should take an hour, like a half hour, because people have questions and you got to sometimes just digest it, and sometimes just having a BS type session. So it's designed to be a little about a half hour, some a little shorter, some a little longer, but it's 10 lessons. So it starts with terms and then moves through with lesson 9 being the accidents. And that's probably going to be an actual hour lesson to go through all the different accidents. And then lesson 10 is talking about the improvements, the fact that we include designs about core ejection. We include designs with startup brake protection, and we include all that stuff. But sitting there going, oh, that's what that means. And actually things are built up. And I wouldn't normally talk about xenon to a group of people because it's such a complex issue. But I'm like, they have to understand xenon to understand Chernobyl.
Right. Yeah, and you're tying it to a story that's so compelling. I remember when Chernobyl came out on HBO, I was like, man, this is pretty damn good.
Yeah.
But it tells the story. And I always thought, just so you were enlisted like me, I got my degree in engineering. What that degree taught me was you always have to pay the piper. Like you said, with wind, people die because of wind power. But if you, and I worked in projects too, when I would say, we had trouble with this vendor, and the next project, somebody said, oh, we have this new vendor. He's the best. They're doing great. No, it's just like the other vendor. We just don't know what their limitations are. But understanding that is so important going into these discussions in my mind.
So I think, and what you're touching on right there is, because it sounds like, I don't know if it was a nuclear company you're working for or not, but one of the big things that Australia is struggling with is the mindset shift. Is that I now have to evaluate, because I had a meeting with some folks, and there's a member of the Australian Submarine Agency who said he had met me. I don't recall meeting him. Maybe I did. Maybe I'm meeting so many people that I can't recall. He's a commander in the Australian Submarine Agency. He's not nuclear trained. And he said, I spoke to him. I got everything I need. I'm like, whoa, you threw a 5-minute conversation, or maybe hearing me talk for 10 minutes, now understand my 23 years of nuclear experience? And I'll tell you this, if you're a commander in the submarine force, you're a ship driver. I'm never going to look at you and go, hey, you know what? You tell me, if you want to tell me how to drive a submarine, I will listen all day long. But I'm not going to tell you, I served on submarines, I know how they work. I still have a lot to learn. And going back to the Kali event, I was struggling with there was some that were concerned about the water source. And so the water source for the coal plant there is from the mining process. So as they're mining, they're using water. And I'm like, that water's got to come from somewhere. And they're like, there's some water rights issue. And I'm like, but they were like super frustrated. And I walk up to them and they're ready to fight. You can see it, like they're amped up. And I'm like, I need to learn. And literally, we ended the event and I made a beeline for him. Grace was like, oh, you stole it from me. I literally was like right out of them. I'm like, hey, you showed a gap in my knowledge of what is going on. I need you to explain it so that I can understand it, so that I could say, hey, maybe this Kali isn't the right place. Maybe you need to find a better location. Ultimately, when I look at it, I go, there is a source of water that powers that coal plant. Where that water comes from, whether it's being used for something in process or not, is somewhat irrelevant. I just need that water to be brought in. And it sounds like there's policies that make it difficult. Like they can do things with water for mining they would not be able to for power. That's a policy issue, not a adequate source of water issue. But then I look at it and go, yeah, but 40 minutes away is the Indian Ocean. So you got all the water you need over there from a cooling perspective. Right. So yeah, so that... But
you're breaking it down to understand where they're coming from. And what I would hope there would be some reciprocity with them to say, yeah, I want to understand your side now.
Their big thing was that they weren't against nuclear. They're like, we just don't think it makes sense in Kali. She goes, we have people that drive from the town that's 40 minutes away to come work in Kali. The people in Kali could go drive 40 minutes over there to work. Like, that's normal. So you could literally build the plant over there and use the Indian Ocean as your water source. Yeah. The big thing is that the sites that were selected for the tour of the small venues, they did the big cities in the 5 states in Australia. They did Perth, Adelaide, Sydney, Brisbane, and Melbourne. They did the capital cities for the 5 mainland states. They didn't go to Tasmania, Northern Territory. They went to Canberra but did not do a public event. They were more working with the politicians. But they also went to these sites that are selected because the Liberal Party has selected 7 sites to be the nuclear. First off, my mind goes, why are you selecting those sites based off of, I get the justification for it. Coal plants exist there. We should swap them out, do a 1-for-1 swap. I understand the premise of it. I get that. But you're not evaluating, say, here's our list of 20 coal sites. Here are our 7 preferred. We'll evaluate them and see if maybe there are better ones to use. But they're not doing that, saying these are our 7. And so when we're going to these events, because Collie is the Western Australia selection, these people that live there don't feel like they're being listened to by their government. And so then here you've got a foreigner like me and a foreigner like Grace that are in there promoting nuclear energy. And they're like, yes, but no one is listening to us. And then someone comes up and I listen to them and I go, oh, now I understand. And they were angry and pissed off when the event ended, but they walked out with huge smiles on their face. That was the difference in someone listening to them. And I get from a political standpoint, it's a borderline Labor versus Liberals. They're hoping maybe they can garner enough support to get the additional MP so that they can get the majority government. The Westminster system is so foreign compared to the U.S. system. But yeah, I mean, it's just definitely interesting learning and just being able to talk and communicate. The Collie crowd was fairly apprehensive, fairly anti-nuclear. And then when I went to Morwell, I have never seen a more pro-nuclear crowd in my life. And they were so excited to have nuclear engineers. We need to take you out and we want to take photos at the coal plants because we think this is awesome. We think, and it was like, whoa, wow. Like I've never, like you go to West Virginia and I have that conversation. I got to have protection because someone's going to try and murder me. Not that West Virginia didn't just repeal their legislation that requires a permanent repository in order to construct new nuclear. So they could build new nuclear in West Virginia now. So they repealed their ban. And I mentioned that and said, hey, West Virginia, anti-nuclear state, they're seeing the writing on the wall that they need it. And whether they're building it or not, that's a different story.
But it's such an exciting time. And it sounds like you have created, even with those small gatherings, is you create a structure around how do we really talk about stuff versus the back and forth. We got 5 minutes. We got to go to a break. Let me cut you off model, which obviously doesn't work when you're trying to change the world, which is what you're trying to do.
Yeah, and it's interesting is that this is like a side gig I'm doing with my regular work too. And the company I work for, we're agnostic. I'm like, we don't sit there and go, Australia should be nuclear. Even my stance from a nuclear perspective is I'm here providing information. Do I think it'd be good if Australia were to repeal their nuclear ban? I think that repealing the nuclear ban would help both parties politically. And I think it would help Labor, which is the anti-nuclear party right now, more than would help Liberal. And the reason why it would help them is that now Liberal actually can't, like, what they're saying, they have to, like, put their money where their mouth is. Right now, they can promise that nuclear, not only will it provide clean energy, but it'll cure cancer. It's going to send an Australian to the moon, and they can make all these promises nuclear can do because they're there. But the second that is gone, now they got to go, oh, crap.
Oh, now we got to do something.
Now I've got to.
But it gets me thinking about our own country where we overbuilt in the 70s and early 80s. So we can mess around with, oh, yeah, we'll stop these nuclear plants and feel good about it or whatever. Doesn't make any difference. But now it's too late to play around. If we want to not have rolling blackouts or stop innovation, whatever that is, we have to pay the piper and get busy.
It's funny. When I gotten big into the advocacy in the United States, I created what I called the Green Nuclear Deal. Literally wrote it like 2 days after the Green New Deal was proposed. Right. So it was like, it's a boring response, right? Nuclear, but it's like, all the same words. It's just clear. And it was a 4-step process, right? I said step 1 was let's build 100 AP1000 reactors in the United States, right? Step 2, SMRs for intermediate and peak loading purposes. Step 3, Gen 4 reactors that can use the waste from the steps 1 and 2, step 4 fusion, right? That was, and no timelines given whatsoever. The only thing I said is that AP1000 step 1, I said select the NuScale and the BWRX 300 for phase 2, because you want 2, and then step 3, use 3, and then ultimately come down to 1 or 2 designs. And then fusion we're far out from. But when I initially drafted it up in a thread on Twitter, and then I had a website, and I posted on the website. The website's gone now because I didn't feel like continuing to pay for it. But so I'd written it up, and I actually had identified sites that were licensed for construction in the 70s, 80s time period, where they'd started digging ground, maybe even started some form of construction. So we already know the environmental impacts from a state of putting a large-scale nuclear reactor here. So I don't need to evaluate it from an environmental perspective. That's been done. We know it works. It was licensed, so we don't need to. And there are enough sites in the United States today because of the rapid expansion in the 70s that we could do that. And I describe that to people here. I'm like, you don't understand, the U.S. only built half of the nuclear that they were intending to. And they're like, what? I said, yeah. So there was another 100 reactors that were licensed and construction began. Part of the problem is they built nuclear so fast. They were building it faster than the grid was expanding. And one of the big complaints that Australians have is that nuclear can't ramp. I'm like, bullshit, it can't. You should look at the way Surrey was operated in the 1970s and 80s. Baseload, intermediate, and peaking. They did it all because there was nothing else. They were providing power for the whole region. Yeah. And it's really interesting because when they mentioned that, I said, so the Surrey Power Station has two 880 megawatt turbines. They can ramp from 5% to 100% power in 90 minutes, each one of them. 600 megawatts we can ramp in 90 minutes. That's faster than the sun goes down. It's so funny because we get asked about the ranking question. I said, that's one nuclear reactor in the U.S., and it's the turbine that's the limiting factor.
Yeah. But you mentioned the way it was. I worked at Calvert Cliffs, and they had CE reactor units and SSS system. Then they had a Westinghouse and a GE turbine because they couldn't get the orders filled without choosing different companies, and what a mess it made. But anyway,
the combustion engineering, that's the one where it's like the weird two loop that turns into four.
Yeah. No, this one's a two loop with two steam generators.
Okay, because
if I remember correctly,
one of the CE ones, it's two loops with two steam generators, but then it splits into two cold legs or something like that.
I'm trying to remember. It's been so long.
Yeah.
There were 4 reactor coolant pumps. I worked on the secondary side.
I mean, plant designs are so interesting because they're so different. I'm certain you've had to manage the cult of thorium. Have you had any dealings? Yeah. So I always have fun with them. And it's funny because all the people in Australia, my fellow advocates, have started acquiring this. Tell me, what about thorium reactors? And I looked at them and go, we don't classify reactors based on fuel. We classify them based on coolant. And then they go, thorium reactors came out. I said, no, that's a product of the coolant, not a product of the fuel. Thorium's a fine fuel. I said, I'm all for using what fuels we have available, but thorium isn't magical. You're describing a LIFT reactor, right? A lithium fluoride molten salt reactor that uses as its fuel. You could also use plutonium or uranium for your fuel. You can actually transition between them. Did you know about Shippingport, the first commercial reactor in the United States? It was a breeder reactor. It started up on U-235. It operated on plutonium. First core, second core, used that plutonium to generate more plutonium for core number 2. Core number 3 was thorium. It's just a fuel.
Yeah.
It's like going up to your gas pump and picking between 81, 83, and 85. Pick which one you want.
Yeah. We had to look to wrap things up. My family's getting ready to come out of bed here. But anything you want to end with that we didn't talk about in terms of your journey? It's been a crazy life already, but what do you think's next for you and your career in Australia or whatever?
All right, what do I think's next for my career?
And we can have you back. We don't have to make it like we'll never hear from you again. But.
I know. So what's interesting is that I don't think there's a limit to what Australia can do, right? I think that's the big thing is I don't think Australians realize where they're at from a nuclear perspective, how ready the world around them is. And whether or not Australia is banned, they're a nuclear nation. Australia's a nuclear nation. The advocates are like, we've been a nuclear nation for 7 years. Indonesia is too, but no one talks about Indonesia being a nuclear nation because of a test reactor, right? Really, we consider nuclear nations if you're generating power, pushing something to the water, or putting electrons to the grid. That's really what defines a nuclear nation. The fact is that Australia is a nuclear nation now because of AUKUS, the nuclear submarine program. The other thing is that there's going to be such a demand for industrial capability in the Indo-Pac region, with India adding 100 gigawatts of nuclear, Indonesia adding 21 reactors, Philippines trying to add reactors, Africa trying to add reactors. There's so much going on in the southern hemisphere in nuclear. 32 nations are nuclear, and most of them in the northern hemisphere. Australia has huge amounts of deposits, all sorts of other. They really are going to become a nuclear nation just from a supply chain perspective. So I think that's huge. And then I think one thing that I want to end a note on is one thing that I have learned is that women in nuclear running the nuclear industry around the planet. And I say this because you get nerds like me, right? The middle-aged white dudes, right? We all have enough of a history. We say we're going to have an engineering conference. It's going to be a bunch of us right there, right? And we're all same kind of thought process, right? This is how we've created our processes. But when you go to a Women in Nuclear event, it's the HR professionals, it's painters, it's everyone. And so they have such a diverse thought process. And I think that's the big thing to go is that if you have listeners that, particularly women that are in the nuclear industry, understand that they're the ones who are leading the charge very much from behind the scenes. I see it here in Australia, I see it in the US. And so my big thing is get involved in Women in Nuclear because you're actually the cutting edge of policy and preparing the industry for the future.
Wow. I never saw that coming, but I appreciate your time, Mark. That was super exciting. I'm excited just hearing your story and what you're doing there, and best of luck in the future.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for having me on. And if you want me back, just let me know.
Yeah, there was so much going on in that episode. I hope you enjoyed it. Please tell a couple friends about the show. Come to the website, which is nuclearleader.com. Reach out to me, Bill at nuclearleader.com. Tell me what you really want to hear. I want to focus in on the newsworthy things that nuclear leaders like yourself need, and hopefully make our industry even stronger than it is today. So let's split atoms and unite people. Until next time, this is Bill Nowicki saying thanks for listening.